Hi, everybody. So in this video, I'm going to talk through the basics of the supply and demand model, and then go into detail about one of the three parts of that model, which is just demand. In the next lecture about this, we'll do supply, and then in the third, we'll put them together where we'll look at how they interact. So to introduce this model, we're going to think about markets. And in this class, when we talk about markets, we're not talking about a physical location. It's more like an abstract place where people exchange things. So it's a mechanism through which buyers and sellers can actually interact, and they can sell things like products, that can be goods, it can be services, and we can also have markets where people buy and sell the factors of production: land, labor, and capital. So in this class, initially, we're probably going to focus primarily on product markets, right? Later on, in the fifth unit of this semester, we'll study factor markets where people trade land, labor, and capital. I already mentioned that there's no physical location for these. You can have really small ones where you have just a handful of buyers and sellers, or you can have huge ones that cover geographically very massive areas. All of these are kind of considered markets. There are different structures of markets that we'll learn about. The simplest one to analyze is actually one that doesn't really exist in reality. It's called perfect competition. And the reason that it's easiest is because we strip out all of the complex things that are making up reality. So we're going to learn about perfect competition in that model first, and then we'll break the rules of perfect competition. So some of the assumptions, right, we talk about models of perfect competition, are that there are a huge number of buyers and sellers. So we have that one here, and there are so many that no one of them can influence the price. And so we think about markets where we do have that. Those would not be considered markets that are perfectly competitive. So if you have maybe just one, right, one seller of a product, that would be a monopoly, and that's not perfect competition. But if you have maybe thousands and thousands of sellers and thousands of buyers, and they're all kind of a small part of it, then that counts as perfect competition assumption number one. The second would be that all the buyers and all the sellers have perfect information about the product. So they all know exactly what the product is about. They don't have any lemon products where the product isn't that good. And somebody's concealing that information. If I try to sell you my used car, you may not know how good of a car it is. In this model, we're going to assume that everybody knows everything about the product, and so they all have perfect information. The third one assumption of this model is that the products are identical, and this is both identical in reality and in perception. So in this kind of a situation, if the product is exactly identical, then you don't need to advertise, because Billy Bob's is exactly the same as Susie Q's when they sell the product. So sometimes one example of a perfectly competitive market that is used would be like a farmer's market, where you have maybe 30 or 40 different farmers who have come together, and they're all selling basically the same kinds of vegetables, right? I get it that in a real farmer's market, maybe some are organic and some are not, but you get the idea here. Imagine that if everybody came and they just all brought the same ears of corn. So in those circumstances, maybe you've got enough sellers, and if you have maybe a few thousand buyers, then they kind of will live up to this perfectly competitive model assumptions. Again, in reality, there's not really a perfectly competitive market out there, but there are some that come close. This model that we're going to use to model this market and others is called the supply and demand model. So the supply and demand model, we'll use it in other circumstances as well. It's probably the most important model in all of economics. And it allows us to think about how do markets set prices and how do markets determine how much to produce. So in order for us to understand the model, we have to understand supply, we have to understand demand. We're going to start with demand because actually most of us have bought things before, and so then maybe it's a little bit more accessible. All right, so now I've said all of that. Let me think about these two phrases, right? You've got this phrase called quantity demanded, and you've got this word called demand. And we're going to assign some fairly technical meanings to these things. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides here. We've talked about that already. But quantity demanded is distinct from demand. These are not the same thing. Quantity demanded is the quantity of a good or a service, right, of a good that consumers are willing and able to buy at a certain price, at a price. So this would be saying if the price of potato chips is $1.99, then this is exactly how many bags of potato chips that consumers are willing and able to buy. So that's called quantity demanded. And if the price changes, it's going to change the amount of quantity demanded. Now, demand is actually all of the different prices and all of the different related quantities demanded. So imagine like a table, and I'll show you one in a second down below, where you have like this price, this quantity demanded, this price, this quantity demanded, this price, this quantity demanded. So we'll say all, it's a representation, it's a relationship of those two things. All the quantities demanded and their prices. And so this is a relationship. Now, some students who are kind of more mathematically inclined, it might be easier to think about this as like y equals, you know, some kind of like equation where it's like 2x, right? And the equation y equals 2x, and I'll just kind of write that here as the example, would be actually the function for demand, because if you plugged in one value, like if you plugged in the price value, you might get the quantity demanded value. And so the function describes the entire relationship, but one value within it would be the price and one value would be the quantity demanded. Now, we're not gonna like graph any kind of equations in this class. So don't freak out, don't cancel this class and drop the class. That's not how it's gonna work. But I do know that sometimes students who are pretty mathematically inclined will go, oh, I get it now. Because if it's a function, that's what demand is. And in fact, in more advanced math, in more advanced econ classes, they do that. They build a function to describe demand. Now, we're gonna show a demand curve, and I'll actually kind of show you here, and then I'll come back to that previous slide, the idea. So the nice thing is in this one, you can see that it's like, okay, at $2, the quantity demanded is 7. And that's a point here, right? $2 and the quantity demanded is 7 or 7.1. That's a weird number. And then if the price is $1.75, then it's 7.5. Now, I'm just gonna draw one off to the side here. You've got Q for quantity and P for price. And demand is downward sloping. Demand goes to the dirt. So that's how you can always remember that, right? Demand goes down, it goes down to the dirt. Don't get it mixed up, okay? So if we were to go from, say, point A to point B on the demand curve, when we go to point A to point B, the price goes down, the quantity demanded, right? This is the quantity demanded, goes up. So we'd say the law of demand is that there is an inverse, ooh, be nice if I could spell, right? Inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price. Now, what does that mean, like in human speak? Oftentimes people screw this up and they'll say, if price goes up, demand goes down. That's not true. Demand doesn't change. Demand is the function. This is critically important that we understand that demand doesn't change when the price changes. And in fact, in just a moment, I'm going to do something that'll explain that. So hang on. Okay, now I'm back. So as you can see, I've got my trusty pirate hat on. And what I'd like you to do at home, and this is going to sound crazy, but bear with me, is this is a nice pirate hat, right? You've got this nice fluting or whatever this stuff is on here. I want you to get your pirate hook out. And this is a pirate hook. You make a pirate hook with your hand. And just so you know, I learned this from another econ teacher. His name's Jacob Clifford. He runs a YouTube channel called ACDC Econ, so you can check him out. But this is how I've learned this. So this is your price, is our little hook. Now, I'm going to say that this hook is the curve. Okay, notice that it's curved. And then we've got a demand curve right below me, right? And now I want you to repeat, and I want you to do this in your very best pirate voice, right? Price doesn't shift the curve. And I want you to tell that to your pirate hook 3 or 4 times in a row. And if you want to do it on 3 with me, that's great, right? I'll demonstrate again, and then we'll do it on 3. Price doesn't shift the curve. And you've got to get a good pirate voice in there. Price doesn't shift the curve. On 3, we're going to do it together, you and I. 1, 2, 3. Price doesn't shift the curve. Okay, one more time just for good measure. Price doesn't shift the curve. Okay, now, I know that you think that I'm crazy, but that way you don't think for a minute that if some question shows up on a test, it's going to say, hey, the price went up. What happened to the demand curve? Price doesn't shift the curve. It doesn't move. The demand curve stays where it's at. Now, there are things that are going to move the demand curve. But if the price changes, the only thing that happens is you slide to a new spot on that demand curve. Got it? So price doesn't shift the curve. It's really, really important. but it does slide you along the curve, right? So if the price of apples goes up, demand for apples stays the same. Now, there are 5 shifters of demand. There are 5 things that would make the demand curve move to the right or move to the left. And when we say right and left in this class, we're saying increase and decrease. An increase is always going to be a shift to the right. A decrease is always going to be a shift to the left. So I'm going to draw that on here so before you forget, right? D, and then I'm going to write INC for increase. And so that is an increase, okay? And then this is D, and then I know it's a little hard to see. I'm going to write decrease. So if it goes to the left, that's a decrease. If it goes to the right, it's an increase. 5 things that'll change demand, that'll actually shift it. First one, and they go in merit, right? That's how merit shifts demand. So market size, number of buyers. If we doubled the number of buyers, right? If number increases, then we're going to use 3 dots. Those 3 dots mean therefore. Therefore, demand increases. So if we double the number of buyers, the amount of demand would shift to the right. Hopefully that one makes sense. It's kind of like, duh. And if the number of buyers decreases, then the demand actually decreases. Expectations about future prices. Future prices. If buyers expect prices to go up in the future, what are they going to do today? They're going to buy more today. If you think the prices of the good is going to be more 2 days from now, you will run out and buy it now before the price goes up. So we'd say demand could increase today, right? And vice versa. If you think the price is going to go lower, you're going to hold off and you're going to delay your purchases. Okay, so it's like the thing about Black Friday, right? There, not too many televisions get sold in the last week of October and the first week of November because a lot of people are waiting for Black Friday. Now, the R in merit stands for related goods or related prices. Now, I already said price doesn't shift the curve, but if the price of a related good changes, it can change the demand for the original good. That doesn't break the rule because price doesn't shift the curve actually refers to the price of the original good. So for example, the price of bananas can have an effect on the demand for apples. Okay, I'll say that again. The price of bananas can have an effect on the demand for apples. But the price of apples does not change the demand for apples. Okay? Now, there are 2 types of related goods. There are complements and there are substitutes. And if you've ever spent any more than about half an hour in a grocery store, you've probably seen this kind of stuff all the time. Complements are goods that are bought together, right? So hot dogs and hot dog buns are commonly purchased together. And we would say if the price of good A goes up, right? So think about if the price of hot dogs goes up, right? And we'll say hot dogs. If that goes up, the price of hot dogs, what do you think is going to happen to the demand for buns? It's going to decrease. Demand for good B will go down because people don't want to buy as many buns if the price of hot dogs is higher. Now notice that it's not the price of hot dogs affecting the demand for hot dogs. It's the price of the hot dogs affecting the demand for buns. Now on a test, the complements are usually pretty much they're like really obvious for you. Although I've had students in the past who are like, I don't know that that's a complement. If you run into trouble with it, we'll work that kind of stuff out. But actually most of the time they even tell you these 2 goods are complements to each other. That means they're bought together. Substitutes are exactly that. They substitute for each other, Coca-Cola and Pepsi. So if the price of good, we'll say C goes up, and I'm just going to call that one Coke, right? If the price of Coca-Cola goes up, what do you think is going to happen to the demand for Pepsi? Well, demand for good D, and we'll say Pepsi. So price of Coke went up, demand for Pepsi is going to go up because people will say, I'm going to hold off on buying Coca-Cola, I'll buy Pepsi instead. And all of these, by the way, they work the opposite way as well. So like, the demand increases for good D in this case because the price of Coca-Cola went up. But what happens if Coca-Cola is on sale this week? Well, if the price of Coca-Cola goes down, then the demand for Pepsi will go down. Okay, income is I. Now, there are 2 types of goods in the world, and they are normal goods and there are inferior goods. And normal goods are just ones where if your income of your buyers, right, income goes up, then the demand goes up for the product. And that's true of almost every product in the entire universe, that as people's income rises, the demand for all of the products that they purchase rises. So like, and this is true for like, Coca-Cola, it's true for cars, it's true for, all kinds of things that they're considered just normal. Now, there are a certain set of goods where if your income goes up, the demand for them starts to fall. And those are called inferior goods. It doesn't refer to the quality of the good. It can be a perfectly good good. Ha! Boy, that was stupid. Your income goes down, then your demand goes up for it. And this is kind of a weird thing to think about, but like think about the kinds of goods where if your income is falling, they sell more of that product. So canned meat, like Spam, is a good example. Another one that students tell me they understand is ramen noodles, right? As your income rises, actually, your demand for ramen noodles falls. People don't usually buy as many of them as their income rises. Again, it's not that the product is inferior in quality, it just describes this relationship of income. The income affects demand, but it depends on what kind of good it is, okay? And then the last one, the T, is taste and preferences. And this one is like if buyers develop a taste for it, right? A taste or a preference, then we'd say your demand goes up. And so, and this could be that they learn that maybe the product is good for you, or the product is, somehow cures cancer or something. So this would be, taste and preferences. So there are 5 shifters of demand. They all both increase and decrease depending on the directions. I wore a goofy hat. I'll see you next time.